The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
So greetings to all of you and my fellow panelists, speakers. I'm going to give a historical perspective of religion and politics in Singapore. And I want to say first off that it is just one perspective. It is my personal perspective, and I'll be focusing mainly on Christianity. Professor Mark Chan is a hard act to follow. And so I've decided to start with something salacious. I'm going to share my screen with you. And I want to start our look at religion and politics in Singapore through the years by taking a slightly longer view with a series of letters that are in the British colonial records at the National Archives in Kew, London. So let me read to you these letters that were enclosed in a confidential government dispatch from Singapore to London at a time when Singapore was a British colony. So the first letter is from Sir James Alexander Swettenham. He was the acting governor of the Strait Settlements, and the Strait Settlements were made up of Singapore, Malacca, and Penang. And in a confidential letter dated 7 December 1898, Swettenham wrote from Singapore to the Reverend W.E. Hodgkinson, the colonial chaplain of Malacca, to say, "I've received with considerable pain and great disgust an official report from the officer representing the government in Malacca to the effect that you, a clergyman of the Church of England and colonial chaplain, after visiting a brothel in that town on the night of the 5th, had been engaged in a brawl with some prostitutes there, and had been brought by them at about 1 in the morning to the Central Police Station, where you borrowed money from the inspector on duty to pay them. Unless you can assure me that the report is entirely untrue, in which case it will become my duty to inquire into the conduct of the police, I must cause charges to be prepared against you under Colonial Regulations 81 to 96, preliminary to your suspension and dismissal." So the next day, Reverend Hodgkinson replied from Malacca. And Hodgkinson said, "Sir, I regret to say that the charge brought against me in your letter dated the 7th is true. In view of the serious infamy that my act may bring to the service and the church, I ask, sir, if I may be allowed to resign." Swettenham replied on 10th December and saying, "In reply to your letter of the 8th, which reached me today only, I decided after much hesitation to accept your resignation of your office of colonial chaplain, which will take effect from today. The treasurer has been instructed to pay you up to this date. My opinion is that your offense merited dismissal, and I've only refrained from taking steps to that object because of the public scandal which these would create, and the pain which would be caused thereby to your brethren in the church." And as was the usual practice in those days, Swettenham sent copies of these letters to London for the approval of the Secretary of State for the Colonies, the British Cabinet Minister in charge of colonial affairs. And so, a month later, on 19th January 1899, the Secretary of State for the colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, wrote the Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, Frederick Temple, forwarding a copy of the dispatch to say that Chamberlain had approved of Swettenham's action in accepting Mr. Hodgkinson's resignation, and that Chamberlain had also requested Swettenham, if he hadn't already done so, to inform the Bishop of Singapore of the circumstances of the case. So of course this is a rather sordid case, an unusual aberration. And I'm sure that since then, there's been no repeat case of any clergyman or Christian leader playing hanky-panky. I speak ironically, sadly. But for the issue of religion and politics in Singapore at hand, this series of letters is very telling. They show that the chaplains in Malacca, Penang, and Singapore were actually civil servants. Swettenham was going to lay charges against the Malacca chaplain, not according to church regulations, but according to colonial regulations. The state hired chaplains and paid their salaries, and so the power to suspend and dismiss chaplains lay with the governor of Singapore, and he could do so without consulting or even informing the Bishop of Singapore. Swettenham had to be reminded to inform the Bishop of Singapore because there was no written record of him having done so. These letters underscore the extremely close relationship between the official church, the Church of England, and the state in British Singapore. Clergymen were government servants, and decisions on ecclesiastical matters were made by government officials. And because of this dependent relationship, clergy in the established church were reluctant to speak up. It was only when the church began to separate from the state that the church developed a voice in the public sphere. So today, in looking at the history of religion and politics in Singapore, I want to talk about the effects both of having too close a relationship between church and state, and how the splintering of that relationship gave the church a voice in the public square. I also want to talk about what led to the passing of the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. So, you'll know that Singapore started out being run by the British East India Company that was based in India. And East India Company was legally obliged by its company charter to provide chaplains for its ships, its garrisons, and its stations overseas. And chaplains were appointed to Singapore from 1825. However, the provision of these chaplains to company employees and colonists concealed the company's reluctance to allow Christian ministry among native populations. This reluctance was born as the company expanded into a colonizing power in India and the Straits settlements. They had to take into account local sensitivities about Christianity. So although there were close bounds between Christianity and the East India Company, the company was very wary about Christian contact with native populations. And it's easy to see why. The company focused on trade and wanted it to proceed smoothly. The company had few officials and a small sepoy army that was greatly outnumbered. It had to legitimize its rule in the eyes of the local population. Therefore, the company could not afford to alienate local rulers or subjects and had little choice but to adopt a pragmatic policy of toleration or religious neutrality towards all religions. And this meant that there would be no compulsory conversions to Christianity, no interference with local religious practices, and even no killing of cows in Hindu areas. And this policy was codified in Section 1 of the Bengal Regulation 3 of 1793. Chaplains provided pastoral services only to company employees and their families, and locals or natives were not evangelized. But chaplains were well compensated. I was saying that chaplains were well compensated, and that Singapore initially was seen as a hardship posting. So chaplains in Singapore drew a salary above their grade, and they were given additional living allowances. So while a chaplain in Bengal in India might have been paid 862 rupees a month, the chaplain in Singapore was given 1,300 rupees a month. And by comparison, in 1851, the governor of Singapore was given 3,000 rupees a month, or 36,000 rupees a year. Eventually, the chaplain's salary was fixed at just under 10,000 rupees a year, but I wonder what the reaction today would be if clergymen were paid today 1/4 to 1/3 of what the Prime Minister earned. But that was the situation 150 years ago. And since the chaplain was dependent on local government for his salary, you would hardly expect the chaplains to jeopardize their rice bowl by acting or speaking contrary to the wishes of civil authorities. On the contrary, the clergy and the local government were on very good terms. Were there things that chaplains could speak out on? Yes, there was the problem of opium addiction. In 1848, 85% of boatmen in Singapore were addicts. As I said, in 1848, 85% of boatmen in Singapore were addicts. However, the government depended on opium for revenue. So in 1868, the only duties payable throughout the settlements were levied on opium, CHANDOO, opium dross, and on all spirituous liquors, toddy and bang. The government also rented out the privilege of producing all these dutiable goods to certain people called farmers. And between 1848 and 1900, the number of government licensed opium shops increased from 45 to 550. So government servants like chaplains could hardly be expected to protest against sources of revenue. So to sum up here, the prevalent view on the role of straight settlements led to a narrow focus of ministry in churches only. Chaplains ministered mainly to Europeans and largely ignored the non-European population. Conditions of service were such that lines of authority led to local government, the paymaster. And although they were employed by a company, chaplains were government employees. They were paid by and subject to the authority of local governments. They were subject also occasionally to military courts martial. As government servants, chaplains were bound closely to government, with which they had very good reason to remain on excellent terms. There is no mention in official records of chaplains commenting publicly on social issues at all. The church in early colonial Singapore, therefore, could not be an independent mediating structure for all the people, and certainly not a dissenting public voice of moral conscience to the government. But chaplains were not the only clergy in the field. On 25th of October, 1819, a mere 6 months after the founding of Singapore, the first missionary landed in Singapore in the person of Reverend Samuel Milton of the London Missionary Society. And, in the absence of other clergymen, Sir Stamford Raffles gave Milton $150, Spanish dollars, to conduct church services in Singapore, and the East India Company granted the London Missionary Society over 1.5 acres of land on a 999-year lease at the junction of North Bridge Road and Bras Basah Road in the center of town to build a chapel. It's about where the Raffles Hotel now stands. The missionaries also set up the Mission Press, the first printing press in Singapore, which printed 66,000 items of religious literature between 1824 and 1833 alone, and 2 million pages of tracts and books between 1834 and 1843. As the Missions Press was the only printer for some time, it also printed government and commercial notices and bills, newspapers, journals, textbooks, and children's stories. From the very beginning, the Mission Press received government support. It was Raffles who gave permission to set up the press because the government was in need of printing services. And later in 1847, the governor of Singapore, Colonel William John Butterworth, was authorized by the East India Company directors to conclude an agreement with the Mission Press for printing forms required for the public offices in the Straits settlements. So years after necessity had faded away, the government continued to engage a religious press to print government forms, gazettes, acts, and bills. One local scholar here asserts that the Mission Press was the government's default printer for the greater part of the 19th century. So access to these presses, I think, did not encourage the missionaries to comment on social issues. Certainly, government patronage would have militated against any criticism of the authorities appearing in print. Now, Raffles also desired educational facilities in Singapore. As early as 1819, Raffles gave permission to the London Missionary Society in Malacca to set up a college in Singapore. And after much consideration, it was agreed in 1823 to transfer the Anglo-Chinese College in Malacca to Singapore as part of a proposed Singapore institution. And donations poured in, with the public in Singapore donating $17,495 in 2 weeks, and Raffles himself giving $1,200. And enthusiasm to build this school can be gauged in comparing this public subscription to the 10,000 raised locally from 1834 to build St. Andrew's Church. However, the project died with Raffles' departure from Singapore. What is clear is that early colonial administrators in Singapore were willing and even keen to use missionary or church resources for secular purposes. Raffles approached a missionary organization to fulfill a dream for his school in Singapore, and later the school be named after him. And local government and businesses employed the mission press as printers throughout the 19th century. Although missionaries were not dependent on local government for their livelihood, there were nevertheless very close links between government and missionaries. So to give you an example, another example, the American missionary, Reverend J.T. Dickenson, became headmaster of the government's Singapore Institution Free School in 1843. And today, that is Raffles Institution. Reverend William Young took over the Malay Chapel, now Princeps Street Presbyterian Church, after the death of missionary Reverend Benjamin Keasbury in 1875. He conducted one service on Sundays. But during the week, Young was paid by the government to supervise 2 government schools. He was a school superintendent. So this gracious tacit support of the church must also have depended on being in the good graces of government. It was only after 1909, when Anglican bishops of Singapore were no longer considered public servants, that they were emboldened to speak out on issues in public. And bishops also had direct channels to higher authority unavailable to other clergymen. So, for example, at the start of the 20th century, an epidemic of venereal disease broke out in Singapore. By 1900, 90% of the migrant workforce population in the Straits Settlements was male, and syphilis was pandemic among them. Among the single male rickshaw pullers in Singapore, specifically, and here I quote from James Francis Warren's book, "Gonorrhea and syphilis were a constant danger. Every rickshaw puller was affected sooner or later." In fact, venereal disease, or VD, in Singapore became so prevalent that a medical committee was empaneled by the government in 1923 to investigate and report on the matter. Its report stated that VD increasingly affected Straits-born Chinese males who passed the disease on to their wives, so that most of the Straits-born women had contracted the disease. Moreover, some doctors were reporting that 80% of their Chinese patients were afflicted with VD. It is little wonder then that a bill incorporating the medical committee's recommendations was soon introduced in the Legislative Council. And the government began an aggressive public campaign against VD with a wall poster campaign and the production of educational films, all featuring scantily clad women. So these public materials, the registration of prostitutes and the opening of treatment centers for VD were all seen as official sanction of immorality. And when the Anglican Bishop Charles Ferguson-Davie was denied an opportunity to offer evidence to the medical committee investigating VD in Singapore, he launched a public campaign instead against the proposed legislation. Now, the bishop was not against the treatment of venereal disease, as his wife was a medical doctor who founded St. Andrew's Mission Hospital for Women and Children in 1923. The wife also opened a venereal disease clinic there in 1924. But the bishop felt that registration would only encourage what he called the sly prostitute, unregistered independent operators. And there developed then a very public dispute between the governor of Singapore, Sir Lawrence Guillemard, and Bishop Ferguson-Davie. And because of this dispute, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, wrote to support Ferguson-Davie, saying that the bishop in Singapore was filling his office extraordinarily well, and it is difficult to exaggerate the importance of what happened in your recent controversy on moral questions. This direct channel to the Archbishop of Canterbury was on at least one occasion used by the Bishop of Singapore to comment on the Singapore governor and agitate for his replacement. Following the MRHA HERTOGH riots in 1950, Bishop Henry Wolfe Baines sent a confidential handwritten aerogram to the Archbishop of Canterbury, reporting that many people had come to him to report a loss of confidence in the leadership in Singapore. Admitting that he had received nothing but kindness from the governor, Sir Franklin Grimson then, whom he personally liked. Baines described him as a devoted churchman. Baines nevertheless requested the Archbishop to mention in the highest quarter and not by political or official channels that the government in this colony lacks the confidence of the people since the riots. That is a serious state of affairs in Singapore, that at the next appointment of governor, we need a big man, and to ask you to make such use of this information as you think best. On receiving this aerogram, the Archbishop sent a personal letter to the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, enclosing a copy of the aerogram and referring to Baines as an extremely level-headed and right-minded person. The Archbishop said that Baines' point of view, if correct, may be of the highest importance. 3 days later, Attlee passed the Archbishop's letter and enclosure to the Secretary of State for the Colonies. Although the Singapore Riots Inquiry Commission laid no blame on Governor Grimson, he retired a year later. So here's a case of the Bishop of Singapore being willing not only to comment on political matters, but to take quiet action to replace a governor. Baines' aerogram shows how the tables had turned. The Bishop of Singapore was now independent and not beholden to the government. He could draw on the support of the public to reflect their sentiments that stronger or better political leadership was needed. And so maybe at this point, church leaders in Singapore began to pose a potential threat to the political leadership. Well, moving on to more recent times in the interest of time, it is clear that Singapore churches have grown steadily in the last 4 decades since independence. The 2010 census showed that 18.3% of Singaporeans aged 15 and above are Christians, about 570,000 Christians out of a total of 3.1 million resident population, an increase of 200,000 Christians in 10 years. I'm looking forward to the figures for the 2020 census. But this growth makes religious harmony a challenge. Ethnic Chinese make up 3/4 of the population, the majority of whom are Buddhists and Taoists. And since independence, it's arguable that the expansion of Christianity in Singapore is most likely a result of conversions of these Buddhist and Taoist Chinese. All this has naturally led to tension between Christianity and other religions in recent years. No religion wants to lose members to another. But beyond Singapore, with the island surrounded by large Muslim neighbors, including Indonesia, largest Muslim country in the world, the growth of Christianity has the potential not only to disrupt the social and political stability of Singapore, but also to affect its relationship with its neighbors. Religious harmony is therefore a major concern of any Singapore government. But there is also no doubt that there is much freedom of religion in Singapore. This is enshrined in our Singapore Constitution. Article 15 1 states every person has the right to profess and practice his religion or her religion and to propagate it. However, as far as the government is concerned, restricting the space of religion in public life prevents religious bodies from being mobilized or exploited for political purposes. As academics Michael Hill and Lian Quen Fee put it, the values conveyed by religious institutions are seen as appropriate to the private sphere only, and thus the operation of such institutions as mediating structures is substantially curtailed. And they quote a speech by then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew in 1988. And PM Lee said then, a religion looks after the spiritual, moral, and social well-being of its followers. But religious organizations should leave the economic, political needs of people to non-religious groups, like political parties. This is because if any religious group tries to define the social economic agenda of Singapore and mobilizes the grassroots by social action programs, other religious groups will do likewise. And once people are mobilized on social economic issues on the basis of religious loyalties, the consequences will be bad for all. So the government therefore not only redefines the scope of religious beliefs according to their own rational categories, it also demarcates the social space within which religions may operate. NUS sociologist Tong Chi Kiong calls this the rationalization of religion. And in this rationalization, the state is careful to accommodate all religions in Singapore and give a high degree of latitude to all faiths. Religious groups are generally allowed to function in our country, although they may be banned elsewhere. So for example, the conservative Muslim Al-Aqam sect is banned in Malaysia, but they are found in Singapore. Other religious groups, like the Falun Gong and the Soka Gakkai, are also found in Singapore, although they may face interdiction in other countries. I think the only groups related to Christianity that are not registered or even banned in Singapore are the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Unification Church, which are perhaps seen as threats to social and political stability. After all, the Jehovah's Witnesses refuse to swear allegiance to the state and perform compulsory national service. And I think many people agree that aspects of the Unification Church are considered repugnant. The inability of these two groups to fit into the social agenda of the government made their exclusion inevitable. Conversely, all religious groups which can be co-opted into the government's agenda or which pose no threat to it may freely operate and even gain government support. So for example, the then Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong officially opened the headquarters building of the Singapore Soka Association on 1st January 1993. And the freedom of religious institutions to operate extends to them running schools and social welfare organizations, all of which can fit into the government's agenda and are supported. In fact, the government actually had an experiment in the mid-1980s with teaching religious knowledge. Between 1984 and 1989, the government required all students in secondary schools to be taught religious knowledge, or RK. Government leaders then were concerned that Singaporean youth were too exposed to negative Western values, and that this would lead to increasing social problems and the abandonment of traditional values. There was also dissatisfaction with the way moral education was being taught in the schools. A 1979 report on moral education severely criticized the teaching of moral values as dull, dogmatic, and too didactic. In contrast, it spoke favorably of moral education programs in mission schools. The report concluded that the strong religious background of teachers in mission schools helped them teach more persuasively. So the government immediately accepted Bible knowledge and Islamic religious knowledge as examination subjects for upper secondary students in 1979. And in 1984, introduced Buddhist studies, Confucian ethics, Hindu studies, and Sikh studies, making the selection of anyone compulsory. All 6 options were generally known as religious knowledge, or RK. Parents could choose any one of these subjects for their children to study from secondary 3 onwards and offer it in the O-level examination. The government produced the teaching materials for all RK classes and also made clear that there should be no attempt to preach or proselytize. The emphasis was on moral values. For example, students studying Buddhist studies could hope to acquire the qualities of moral awareness, social responsibility, and psychological maturity. It's curious for me that the government did not merely revamp its existing moral education program, but took the more laborious and unpredictable route of religious education. Government believed that religious education would solve problems in society, and so it made all secondary school students study a particular religion for 2 years and then take an O-level exam in it. This venture was bound to have serious consequences on religious awareness because until then, even in mission schools, all students had not been required to study either the Christian faith or the Bible. And true enough, it was soon realized that the exclusive study of one religion actually emphasized differences and unintentionally attracted students to Buddhism and Christianity, which was seen as more rational. A study commissioned by the Ministry of Education in 1988 confirmed that RK had unexpectedly contributed to a trend of religious revivalism in Singapore in the 1980s. And so RK was therefore withdrawn the next year and replaced by a new civics and moral education program in 1992. The Common CME program teaches all major religions in Singapore from a historical and objective perspective. Its focus remains the teaching of moral values, but in addition, CME produces the appreciation of other religions and religious harmony. So for example, there's a useful guide to etiquette at the various religious festivals. But since government policy is to avoid transmitting religious values and beliefs and arousing religious experience, all exclusive and controversial claims of religions and potentially offensive words and issues were omitted from the teaching materials. In her analysis, Charlene Tan comments that on the one hand, there is now little worry that religious differences would be heightened. But on the other hand, it is difficult to see how moral values can be imparted in this approach. Both the implementation and cancellation of RK have the flavor to me of hastily improvised measures with scant regard of ramifications. What is also important is that religious harmony became a focus in the new CME program. It continues to be a crucial focus of government policy today. Still, the government's use of RK classes had the unintended consequence of contributing to church growth. Their own 1988 report draws that conclusion. Instead of uniting citizens in a multi-religious country, RK lessons accentuated differences and unexpectedly favored Christianity and Buddhism. These were reasons enough to make any government hesitate. But there was another reason for the rapid move away from RK, and this was the alleged 1987 Marxist conspiracy. In 1987, the Internal Security Department, ISD, arrested 22 young Catholic Church activists and accused them of being in a Marxist conspiracy to overthrow the government. Australian academic Michael Barr quotes the then Prime Minister as dismissing those arrested as do-gooders who wanted to help the poor and dispossessed. Yet as Barr summarizes the event, and here I quote him, 20 people, none of them priests, were detained for several months and 2 more for several years. Most report being tortured and beaten, and all signed confessions dictated by their interrogators, though some recanted their confessions after being released. They were also paraded before the public as subversives and communists. The subversive activity that Barr claims that the detainees had been engaged in was a wide range of industrial activism. They had been counseling migrant workers to exercise their rights. They campaigned against the government's introduction of the 12-hour shift, and they tried to raise awareness of industrial issues like minimum wage, workers' compensation, and retrenchment. Although no Catholic priests were arrested, priests were involved, and the government was concerned with 4 in particular: Father Edgar D'Souza, Father Patrick Goh, Father Joseph Ho, and Father ARCHBISHOP. In the ISD's notes of the meeting between Lee Kuan Yew and Catholic Archbishop Gregory Yong on 2nd June 1987, examined by Barr, PM Lee repeatedly emphasized that the government had the right to arrest these priests. He was concerned that the priests had the potential to be motivated by liberation theology and engage in revolutionary politics. The 4 priests were eventually pressured to leave Singapore. And Barr argues that Lee knew that the priests and detainees were not engaged in seditious activities, but targeted them because they displayed a capacity and willingness to voice opposition to government initiatives, and so threatened the government's capacity to set the agenda for public discourse. If Barr is correct, and Barr might very well be wrong, these priests were pressured to leave Singapore because, like every other person, they had the potential to be motivated by doctrine and the willingness to voice opposition. Social activism by a religious group had morphed into subversion and treason. The ground rules then for religions in general and Christianity in particular were laid down in PM Lee's National Day rally speech on 16th August 1987. PM Lee delved at length into the infiltration of the Catholic Church by Marxists. He said that while the government was favorably disposed towards religion because it helped people cope with change, and absolutely neutral towards all religions, Catholic priests and Christian pastors should not go beyond religious activities into social action. And he said, churchmen, lay preachers, priests, monks, Muslim theologians, all those who claim divine sanction or holy insights, take off your clerical robes before you take on anything economic or political. Take it off. Come out as a citizen or join a political party, and it is your right to belabor the government. But you use a church or religious publication in your pulpit for these purposes, and there will be serious repercussions. In the aftermath then of the Marxist conspiracy, the government was eager to keep the church out of the public square. When Parliament opened on 9th January 1989, the President said in his address that while religious organizations have always done educational, social, and charitable work, they must not stray beyond these bounds, for example, by venturing into radical social action. This was because religious polarization will cause sectarian strife. The President called the entry of religious groups into the political process a taboo. They had to stay out and could not themselves be manipulated to win political support. The President said that ground rules will be spelled out clearly and unequivocally, and that all political and religious groups must abide by them scrupulously. It was up to the government then to articulate these ground rules. And so, on 21st September 1989, the Straits Times published an article on its comments and perspective page that denounced any extensive and pervasive use of modern technology to proselytize religion to the uninitiated. And this was in response to a report that unsuspecting people had been paged to call a phone number that led to a recording of a Christian sermon and a hymn. The article contended that it was not acceptable proselytizing in a manner which reaches all and sundry, especially to those who take offense to such things. Those who did so were castigated as threatening religious harmony and upsetting the fragile balance between various religions. And so the writer opined that it would be ideal if the different religious groups can continue to preserve the harmony by observing commonsensical codes of conduct. Moderation and toleration are the key words to preserving the peace. But if self-rule is not possible, then perhaps some form of ground rules need to be imposed by the state. The writer went on to ask, in this regard, it is opportune to ask what has happened to the proposal made in May this year by the government that laws be introduced to prevent overzealous religious preachings from threatening the harmony in Singapore. So obviously this call for government action was prescient, harbinger of things to come. In October 1989, the Minister of Home Affairs confirmed in Parliament that legislation would be introduced at the next sitting. He warned, the government takes a serious view of religious leaders who stray beyond the confines of religious activities. And by the end of the year, a white paper on the maintenance of religious harmony was issued, and the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, MRHA, followed shortly after and came into force on 31st March 1992. I'll leave the next speaker to talk about the legal framework of the MRHA. But let me sum up by saying that in earlier days, when chaplains were paid by the local government and missionaries received government patronage, they were consequently less willing to speak out against the government on social issues. It was only when the close links with government were broken or loosened did the church gain a public voice. But while there's certainly a great need for religious harmony, toleration, and moderation, especially in the public sphere, it wasn't just aggressive and insensitive proselytization and religious tensions that led to the MRHA, but other perceived threats like a Marxist conspiracy. Of course, we must be very careful and sensitive, and I certainly echo the then Deputy Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong when he said in Parliament in 1990, if there's no harmony, there will be no peaceful, prosperous Singapore. As simple as that. Religion can be a source of friction, and while the MRHA has worked in the last almost 30 years, it is still up to all of us to maintain religious harmony, especially for us Christians, because as Professor Mark Chan said earlier, it is at the cross where politics and religion meet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ming Shun, for giving us a very in-depth, insightful, and for situating the whole relationship of church and state in our historical context. Okay, there are some questions that have come in, so let me just raise them up. There's one from Ronald He, and he asked, would it be accurate to say that nearly all British officials were Christian and that most were Anglican? And if so, they would be congregants and the pastors would be engaged in dialogue and ministering to them. I suppose that refers to the earlier part of your presentation. Would you want to respond to that?
Yes, it's true. For most of the 18th and 19th century, actually, to be any civil servant or to hold any public office, you had to be a communicant member of the Church of England. So yes, it would be fair to say that most, if not all, officials then in Singapore would have been members of the Church of England. But then the question was, were they Christians in name or were they active, fervent believers? I think it'd be hard to say one way or the other.
Okay, if I may follow that up with a question. So what about the congregants from the other mainline denominations, like the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Lutherans? Because in your presentation, you mentioned basically the relationship between the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the colonial government. How was the relationship between the colonial government and the other churches?
The colonial government was generally very open to all these missionaries and other denominations. I'll give you an example. The government in the 19th century and even at the start of the 20th century provided education in Singapore only in the vernacular, in Malay, in other words. So it was left to mission schools and clan organizations to provide for education in other languages like English, Chinese, even Tamil. And the government supported all of them by giving them a per capita grant. But the government gave a per capita grant to schools that provided education in English that was 10 times what they gave to other schools providing education in other languages. So it was only the Christian mission schools that were providing education in English. So you could be argued that the government was supporting all these Christian mission schools 10 times more than they were supporting schools set up by other kind organizations and religions. So I think, yes, they would have been very favorable, even openly, to churches of all denominations.
I have a question about about the earlier part of the presentation. It seems to me that your description, the narrative then was about the relationship between the colonial government and the chaplains, and how they were inextricably bound in that sense. So do you have any record of the relationship between the colonial government and the church in Singapore? I mean, the indigenous church in Singapore. I mean, I understand that was probably still a nascent, embryonic church. Or was it that they were only interacted with through the chaplains? Because otherwise, this close relationship between the chaplains and the colonial government could be seen as an intra-empire affair. Doesn't reflect fully on the church-state relations that we are concerned with today.
Okay. That's a good point. But don't forget also that for a large portion of the 19th century, the Anglican chaplains and clergy were the only ones in Singapore. Because after the Treaty of Nanking opened up China in 1843, all other missionaries, except for Benjamin Keasbury, left Singapore to go to China. Benjamin Keasbury was the only missionary left in Singapore, and other denominations did not come in till much later. So Methodists, for example, came in the 1880s. So, so from 1843 onwards, for decades then, even when Singapore became a crown colony, the colonial chaplains sort of carried the flag for everybody. And I focus on the colonial chaplains because they were here all the way till 1929. They were supported by the government all the way to 1929.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
But I get your point, and I think definitely more work needs to be done on how the government interacted with other denominations then. So the problem is a matter of archives. Do these denominations have records then that are open to researchers?
Thank you. There are some questions that are not entirely relevant to your talk. So let me just bring one forward that is, I think, somewhat relevant. Okay. Would you agree that laws to regulate religious harmony is inevitable? And the questioner continued to say, because Christians tend to ignore common sensical rules of conduct in their spiritual fervor.
Okay, as a Christian, I must strongly protest that we are not we are thought to be not commonsensical people. But I wouldn't say it's inevitable, because after all, I think aside from Turkey, Singapore is the only country that has religious harmony laws. It was inevitable. Other older countries would have these laws also. But I would say it is probably necessary in Singapore because, as the Pew Research Group said, we are the most religiously diverse country in the world. So yes, for the sake of religious harmony, I think it is the government's right to lay out the boundaries.
Okay. And there's one more question about the relationship, okay, about mission schools. So Richard Ong says that he hears that MOE wants mission schools to have the chapel services outside of the regular school timetable. Okay, that's what he's heard. Huh? In his opinion, this is encroaching on the religious sphere. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the question is quite correct. I think MOE does require chapel services to be outside curriculum hours. But as to whether this is encroaching, I'm not sure. I think school services and education in Singapore and mission schools are provided to all religious, all people regardless of race, language, or religion. Racial groups. So yeah, I don't think I want to comment any further on that. Leave it to the mission schools to regulate themselves.
Okay. Thank you. Is there something you want to add to your presentation? Right now, we have some questions, but I think we are still processing them.
Not at the moment. I'll be interested to see what the questions are. I maybe want to stress that I'm not in any way criticizing the present government. I'm just laying out what has happened before, and history is what it is.
Yes. So I take it that your thesis is that the one of or a few factors that led to the maintenance of the Religious Harmony Act was not merely the religious knowledge classes, but also the so-called the Marxist conspiracy. That there was some concern about extremists or perhaps political activists hijacking religious agenda, right? I think that is of course I'm not familiar with that. I'm not acquainted enough with that issue to raise certain questions, but I just want to ask, in your opinion, does the legislation of this law, has that helped to smoothen the situation somewhat?
Well, it depends what situation you're talking about. I'm not sure it does, because the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act has to deal specifically with people using the pulpit for subversive purposes or political purposes. It doesn't prevent extremists from coming out beyond the reach of religious leaders. So people are being self-radicalized today. MRHA has nothing to say about that. So on one hand, it works for a group of people. On the other hand, it's completely irrelevant to another group of people.
It means there are those group of people who, in the first place, would not choose to follow that in the first place, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let me see if there are any final questions. There are some questions about magic, but I don't recall you mentioning anything about magic. So I think we might have to take this up on another forum. Okay, there are some questions. Okay, Richard Hutton asks, the Christian faith talks about taking care of the poor and caring for others, which could be viewed as economic policy. Should this be allowed?
Say again.
Yeah, his question is, the Christian faith talks about taking care of the poor, and let me see, yes, jump, and caring for others, which should be viewed as economic policy. Should this be allowed?
Oh, well, it is being allowed, but it's not just the Christians are doing it. I think it's all religions were doing it. If you go up to, what is that village called? There's a village of homes up north for the underprivileged, and those are run by different religious organizations, not just Christians. Not one of them run by Christians, but one I think run by the Baha'i, and so on and so forth. So these are being allowed, and it's not just Christians doing it. And sure, I don't see what's wrong with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's one quick question. I think we'll take this as a final question because it's 12:01. There's a question here about people would not question about secularism or humanism voicing in politics. Similarly, for parity, what should be enacted for mission schools should also be with other religious schools. So Singapore policies have always been pragmatic. We don't think all are equal, but we figure out what is equitable. So the question is, how can Christians help to uphold this parity?
As to what new laws should be enacted, that is beyond my expertise. I leave the question to Professor Eugene Tan to answer.
Okay, I think that's it because we are running short of time, and I do apologize if we've not been able to answer all your questions, but please remember that we do have 2 more speakers coming up, and I'm sure you'll find that the presentations will be just as equally interesting. So on behalf of the virtual audience, may I now thank our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Chiang Ming Shun.